Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Are they playing politics, Mark?
Yes, this is not just a cynical decision by Jeremy Corbyn that I think will harm the Labour Party. It's one that I think harms our democracy more widely. Let's not forget, 32 months ago, this country did a remarkable and quite rare thing in that our Parliament, hundreds of our MPs voted to ask the people to have a once-in-a-generation decision about how our country's governed, about our relationship with the EU, and about whether our laws are made through a democratically accountable system in the UK or whether they're made in Brussels. And the people turned out in extraordinary numbers to take part in that. The biggest vote for anything, any idea or person in our history was for leave. The second biggest vote was for remain. It was a hugely engaged referendum, a remarkable thing to occur. Every party, every major party promised it would honour that promise. And now, just as we approach the deadline of it happening, one of the two major parties, supposedly of government in this country, has said, you know what, actually, maybe we didn't mean it, maybe we'd go back on that. And to tell millions of people, 17.4 million Leave voters, but also the rest of the country, who they told at the election they would honour this outcome, that actually, you know what, if for opportunistic reasons it comes up that we might open the door to just having another go, see which version of the people's opinion we'd like to keep getting until we find one we want to be bothered to keep our promise about, I think that's outrageous.
In May, the Electoral Commission found very serious electoral offences against Leave.eu, which was a subsidiary organisation in the vote. But then, most importantly, in July, against Vote Leave, the main campaign, and it found that Vote Leave had committed very serious electoral offences and imposed maximum fine levels and referred them to the Metropolitan Police. And then in October, there was a judgment in the Divisional Court that found that the Electoral Commission had also given incorrect advice on what could be spent. And the result of that is that effectively Vote Leave spent about $500,000 more than it was entitled to spend. And it spent that money in the last week of the campaign on AIQ and Facebook ads. Now, the referendum was, of course, advisory. So the question then was, what was Theresa May going to do with that advice? And she was absolutely sure that the result was the democratic will of the people.
So she's behaved as if it were binding.
She's exactly.
But it's not a legal nicety to point out that it isn't.
Well, first, it's not binding, but secondly, she's treated it as binding. Yes. And the crucial point was that had it been binding, it would have been voided by way of some statutory mechanism or under the common law.
So just, this is the point. Forgive me for being a bit slow on the uptake. If the referendum, and many Leave voters in particular still believe it was binding, if the referendum had been legally binding, then the findings of the Electoral Commission would have rendered it invalid.
Well, you would have expected Parliament to have legislated for a process whereby it would have been rendered invalid.
Because if it's been corruptly delivered, how on earth can we be held to it? But because it wasn't binding, we can be held to something that was corruptly delivered.
Exactly. Well, our argument...
I've only been back on holiday for 53 minutes and my head's spinning already.
Well, our argument was that actually under the common law, forget statute, under the common law, the concept of democratic has a very clear meaning, and it means legal, i.e. if you cheat, it's not democratic and you've got to do it again. And that's mirrored in the Venice Commission and international law. So international law has effectively adopted the common law and said if there's mass cheating,
which there was, then the result will be voided. So that's fascinating because, of course, the will of the people is meaningless if the people were victims of corrupt practices or lied to.
Exactly. And the right to vote is not a right to tick a box. It's a right to tick a box in a legal process. Because obviously ticking a box in a process that involves massive cheating is not worth doing. So what we were saying was, well, Prime Minister, you acting reasonably cannot simply ignore this. You've got to respond in some way. You've got to at least acknowledge this has happened and do something about it, either take it to another vote, extend time, put it to Parliament, have a public inquiry. What you can't do is simply say, I don't want to know about this. This didn't happen. And that was effectively our argument, and that was dismissed.
So the court essentially found that the Prime Minister is not obliged to take account of the mounting evidence that casts doubt on the legitimacy of the referendum.
Well, it's
because
slightly worse than that, I'm afraid. It's slightly worse than that because the High Court actually found that we were too late. We were out of time.
Yes.
So the High Court said we should have brought the claim within 3 months of the expenses having been lodged at the Electoral Commission, which have been December 2016, or 3 months off her notification. But of course, at that point, nobody knew about any of this. So we were in a kind of...
It was only in July that that 675 grand that suddenly popped up in the fashion student's bank account was discovered.
Well, there were rumours around, but certainly when she notified, the Electoral Commission had in fact closed its investigation, and a judicial review had to be brought against the Electoral Commission to get them to reopen it, which led to their result in July 2018. So we've actually been told we should have done something which was impossible, and in fact would have failed at that point because it was impossible. And we've also been told, well, Parliament's now in control, which we know this week is not true.
In control of the thing that Theresa May keeps postponing.
Exactly.
Yes.
So Parliament's taken control of the process. And we've also been told that administrative convenience requires that this sort of be let go of. And as I said to the court, it is difficult to see how it is administratively convenient to treat an unlawful referendum as lawful. But in any event, the final thing which the court kept asking about was, well, how can we prove it actually had an effect? And the law is clear that you don't have to prove it because, of course, you can't. If someone cheats in a bicycle, in a Tour de France, you can't actually prove
that they
wouldn't have won if they hadn't taken those drugs.
Sure. And this is where Emily Thornberry, sitting in this chair last week, somewhat disingenuously was arguing that nobody thinks that they were influenced by the AIQ.
Yeah.
So that it plays into that narrative, albeit not in legal terms, but in rhetorical terms.
And we were arguing that it wasn't just the Electoral Commission's findings, it was also the ICO finding Leave.eu 120 grand, the DCMS findings, the AIQ Mueller investigation,
which
everything.
The Canadian Parliament has done astonishing work doing, but ours, despite the best efforts of Damien Green, remains curiously quiet. And we still don't know where the 8 million quid that Aaron Banks spent came from,
No, well, that's being investigated by the National Crime Agency, and they won't give us any information as to where they've reached. So we wrote to both...
I understand that. You do as well, presumably, because it's an ongoing investigation and they don't want to kind of let any...
I understand that, but there is real concern about the delay because the Met has had this information since July 2018 and the NCA slightly later, although the Leave.eu was referred in May 2018. So there is concern about the delay because Brexit, 29 March 2019.
Yes, 2 weeks after the meaningful vote. Yeah.